Welcome to another lesson of A&P Madness with Dr. H, and today we're going to be starting up on respiratory system. So we're just going to dive into the introduction to the respiratory system. For instance, what's the basic function of the respiratory system? Gas exchange. We're going to be exchanging oxygen from the atmosphere into our bloodstream, and when we breathe out, CO2 is going to go from our bloodstream into the passageway that allows air to leave the body, and then we breathe that CO2 out. But hopefully you guys can see that that's not the only function of the respiratory system. There are going to be other functions. It's not just gas exchange, because why? We need to get the air in and out of our lungs. So a very important aspect of the respiratory system is to understand the conduction of air, or the air passageways that allow for air to flow from the atmosphere into the body. There are other functions of the respiratory system. Speech, the sense of smell, these are all going to be part of the respiratory system. Acid-base balance, we'll talk more about that later. Angiotensin converting enzyme, we talked about that in the cardiovascular system and the control for blood pressure. Venous return. Again, we talked about that in the cardiovascular system. You take a deep breath in, it inflates the lungs, puts pressure against the blood vessels, pushes more blood back to the left side of the heart, so the heart has better function. And then every time you take a deep breath in, well, a big part of the respiratory system is going to be taking the air you just breathed, which is full of bacteria and dust. It's not at room temperature, it's not at body temperature. It's got dust and bacteria inside of it. We're going to need to filter the dust. We're going to need to filter the bacteria. We're going to need to have an immune system that starts to fight that. We're going to need to humidify the air and bring that air to body temperature by the time it makes it to the lungs. And all of that helps with the gas exchange. But let's start here with the respiratory system. I have a pre-diagram of the major anatomical features of the conduction pathway of the respiratory system, and that's drawn over here. But I also want to start to write out a simplified, where do I start? What template can I start to study the respiratory system with, Dr. H? And I think any student can start to study the respiratory system by understanding that there are four major processes. Respiration. And respiration is kind of it's a misused term often. Respiration has a specific definition. We're going to talk about it in just a second. But there are four main processes of respiration that I think everybody should know. The first process of respiration is the physical act of breathing. The very first thing that has to happen is air is going to have to flow from the atmosphere around us into our lungs. And this is called ventilation or pulmonary ventilation. This is ventilation, the physical act of breathing. And most people can think about this because they've heard of ventilators before. If you put a patient on a ventilator, you are physically breathing for them. That being said, you're not doing any gas exchange for them. Their body's still going to have to do that work. You're just doing the mechanical aspect of breathing. And that's what ventilation is all about. So how do we define ventilation? We can do that with an equation, because pulmonary ventilation is the physical act of breathing, or air moving in and out of the lungs. So we can just call this the air passageway, or let's simplify it. We can say with pulmonary ventilation, air is moving, or we have moving air. And if we are moving air, what we have is airflow, right? We have flow. And we've learned about this before when we were dealing with the cardiovascular system. We said blood flows through the tubes air flows through the tubes too. And it's going to be the same physics that drives the flow of air. So airflow is proportional to a pressure gradient. A pressure gradient is going to be required to move air. What's going to be opposing the movement of air all the time? If you're pushing air through tubes, those tubes have resistance. Okay, so when you're thinking about the first process of respiration, you should be thinking about pulmonary ventilation, which is all about flow. How do we get airflow? We're going to have a pressure gradient, and it's going to be resisted. When we were talking about blood flow, we found out that the pressure gradient is created by a muscular pump. It's going to be no different here. We're still going to have a muscular pump that creates this pressure gradient. There's going to be a little bit more to it. We're going to have other pressure gradients that help the lungs stay inflated. So in order for a pressure gradient even to be created in the first place, the lungs must be inflated. And that's going to be part of the lesson in another lecture, but I'm just summarizing it for you. Whereas resistance is just the typical Bézoul's law, right? Where it's going to be 8 times the length times the viscosity divided by the radius, pi r to the 4th, which is going to drive that resistance. So we'll deal more with that later. Let's just leave it at that. The next thing that I want to point your guys' attention to is, what is the next thing that I want to point your guys' attention to? I guess the next process of respiration. So once you get air into your lungs, it's going to pass down through all these tubes, and it's going to make it down to these little sacs at the very end of the road that are called alveolar sacs. And within the alveolar sacs, there are individual alveoli. Alveoli are made up of simple squamous epithelial tissue. Why is that important? Because they're very, very thin. And the thinner the tissues, the better things can diffuse across them. And that's exactly what we're going to talk about next. From pulmonary ventilation, we get the air into our lungs, and now gas exchange can occur. And it's occurring in a specific location, the alveoli. So the first thing that's going to happen is we're going to have alveolar gas exchange. Well, what is the definition of gas exchange? It's respiration. So we're just going to summarize this and say, this is respiration, where respiration is gas exchange. That's what it means. So anytime you guys hear the word respiration, be thinking of gas exchange. Alveolar respiration. Well, we have something, a little formula, that can help us understand alveolar ventilation a little bit better. And it's called Fick's law. And Fick's law is pretty complex. There's a lot of variables that go into Fick's law, but we're going to simplify Fick's law. And we're going to say Fick's law is all about the speed at which diffusion occurs, the rate of diffusion. And there are some major drivers of diffusion in the human body. The very first thing that's required for diffusion, well, what is diffusion? It's things moving from areas of high to low. So we're talking about gradients here. So for diffusion to occur, no matter what we're dealing with, we must start with a gradient. There must be a gradient, whether it's a pressure gradient or an electrical gradient or a chemical gradient. We must have a gradient in order for anything to flow. That's going to come back into play when we're talking about the movement of air. Air is going to move from an area of high pressure to low pressure. Oxygen is going to move from an area of high partial pressure to low partial pressure, so forth, so on. What's required for diffusion? A gradient. What else is going to impact the rate that diffusion can occur? A surface area. We're just going to abbreviate that SA, surface area. The greater the surface area, the greater the speed that diffusion can occur across that. And your lungs are big. Take and flatten out all the alveoli of your lungs, and it's basically a tennis court. It's huge. That's a lot of surface for air to diffuse across. What else? Membrane permeability, which relates back to the molecule too. And if you think about the molecules involved in gas exchange, now we're talking about oxygen, O2, extremely small and nonpolar. So it has a very high membrane permeability. It can pass right through that membrane. Carbon dioxide, small and nonpolar, also highly permeable. So what's that going to do to the speed that can diffuse? It's all directly proportional. So it would increase the speed it can diffuse. What is opposing diffusion all the time? What's in opposition? Well, that is simply related to the distance something has to move. So this is Fick's law. Okay, the rate of diffusion is proportional to the gradient times the surface area times membrane permeability. All three of those, as they go up, the diffusion speed goes up. What's opposing it? The distance it has to travel. The thicker the distance, the slower the diffusion. Why are alveoli simple squamous epithelial tissue with a very, very thin modified lamina propria? The answer is because diffusion. We need to have these alveoli be as thin as possible so things can diffuse as fast as possible. And what would happen if that distance increased? Then the speed at which it diffuses decreases. And this is going to happen in something like pulmonary edema, pneumonia, etc., etc., etc. That all increase the distance that something needs to diffuse. Really slows everything down. Once oxygen gets into the bloodstream, now we're going to need to transport that oxygen. It's not just magical, right? Oxygen doesn't just make it out to the tissues. Now we are going to need to transport this. And what did we learn in the cardiovascular system is transporting oxygen around. Those are the erythrocytes. I could spell, I swear, right? And transportation is going to be occurring due to the erythrocytes, primarily the red blood cells, but we're also going to have something occurring in the plasma as well. You'll see in another lecture more on transportation of oxygen and CO2, because CO2 is going to have to make it back out of this system. Last but not least, the fourth process of the respiratory system is once we get this oxygen to the tissues, this is now where the next step of respiration has to occur between the capillaries and the tissue, right? This is where capillary gas exchange allows for the cells to pick up oxygen. Wait, what? Isn't that something we've learned about before in multiple biology classes called cellular respiration? And that's what we're dealing with here, right? This is now going to be cellular respiration, in which these cells are picking up a number of things from the blood. And we're just going to simplify this, and we're going to say we have glucose, we have oxygen, which is coming from this respiratory system. We're going to throw some phosphate groups at it. We'll have some inorganic phosphate, some ADPs. And what's that going to do? As this chemical reaction occurs, we make ATP. A little bit of heat comes out of this as well, but we want ATP. And what other metabolic waste is there? CO2, carbon dioxide. That's leaving the system. We'll get back to that in just a second. What else is metabolic waste? Water. This will be important as you go through the respiratory system. This part of the curve, this part of the chemical equation is going to directly relate to the acid level of the blood. So please don't minimize this. This is very important down here. But as the cells have gas exchange, O2 is going into the cells, being converted to ATP. CO2 now is going to be going down its gradient. It's high in the cells because the cells are making it. And then CO2 goes into the blood and is transported to the alveoli where we have gas exchange again. And then you breathe out. So oxygen in, CO2 out. It's just a cycle. These are the 4 processes of respiration. And the way we want to now go about understanding the first process of respiration, this is where respiratory anatomy comes in. Okay, so when we're dealing with the anatomy of the system, that's what I drew over here. And if we want to do an introduction to respiratory system, we also need to think about the anatomy. So we're going to say processes and anatomy. I can spell. Sometimes I can spell. Processes and anatomy. And when we're dealing with the anatomy, I recommend that you guys just do a flow chart. So introduction flow chart for anatomy. It's going to be much more complex than this, but start with a template y'all can follow. Where is the very first location? As you take a deep breath in, by the way, breathe in through your nose, not your mouth. The mouth is part of the digestive system, not the respiratory system. So breathe in through your nose. What's the first place that air enters? The nose, right? So we're just going to say, where's the first place it goes? It goes to the nose. Now, there's anatomy of the nose. There's an external nasal nair. There's a nasal cavity with the superior, middle, inferior nasal meatuses. There's an internal nasal nair. So there's an anatomy that you guys need to know. But just start with a template. Where's the first place air enters? The nose. Okay? And as it enters into the nose, it's going to pass through the nasal cavity. And from the nasal cavity, it goes to what's called the throat. Now, the throat is the back of the nose, the back of the mouth, and then in front of this crazy weird structure down here, which is called the larynx. Let's summarize what the throat is called. It's just called the pharynx. Okay, all of the pharynx. You will be able to subdivide these later because there's a place at the back of the nose called the nasopharynx, back of the throat called the oropharynx, back of the larynx called the laryngopharynx. Let's just summarize it as an introduction as the pharynx. So now as air passes from the throat, it's going to pass into the voice box, right? Well, it's not called a voice box. It's called the larynx. From there, air is going to pass into this structure down here, these cartilaginous rings. This is the windpipe, but medically speaking, we call it the trachea. From the trachea, air will pass into the right and left lungs. In order to do that, the trachea branches into what's called bronchi. Okay, bronchi is plural, bronchus, US is singular. And the bronchi are going to branch. And they're going to branch and they're going to branch and they're going to branch and they're going to branch. And they're going to get smaller and smaller and smaller as they branch. And they're going to go through over 12 different orders of branching until they get small enough. Once they are small enough, we no longer term them bronchi. By the way, they're going to lose the cartilage too as they get too small, and they're going to become bronchioles. Just like arteries became arterioles, bronchi become bronchioles. Just like arterioles had smooth muscle around them that allowed us to change the diameter of them, bronchioles will be similar. So bronchioles will play a very important role in resistance when you guys finally get there. Bronchioles, there are a bunch of different types of bronchioles. There are terminal bronchioles and respiratory bronchioles. Okay, but let's do a template again. From the bronchioles, where's that air going to finally pass down into? Now we're finally down at the level of the alveoli. This is great This is a template you can follow. This is a template you can learn all of the anatomy of the respiratory system through. Because now what are you going to do? Go back to the nose and break it into its subdivisions. Internal and external nasal nares, the nasal meatises. Pharynx, break it into its subdivisions. Larynx, bunch of different cartilages, 9 different pieces of cartilage in there. You can learn all of those. Trachea, what's so cool about the trachea? Trachealis muscle, trachealis cartilage. Bronchi, the different orders of bronchi, okay, whether it's lobar, segmental, so forth, so on. Bronchioles, terminal versus respiratory, and alveoli. There's a lot of really cool anatomy going on with the alveoli, but that's for another lecture. This is just an introduction. And now you guys have a template. Every time you go to study the respiratory system, try to use this template. Learn about ventilation. What equation should you write down the second you see ventilation? Write down this equation and ask yourself, how does a respiratory change these things? I'll have an entire new lecture about that. Alveolar respiration and cellular respiration are both going to depend on Fick's law. At the cellular level, we're also thinking about metabolism. Transportation is going to depend on the saturation of our erythrocytes. Oxygen saturation, pretty big deal in the medical world. So that's going to have its own lecture as well. I sure hope you guys find this helpful as just an introduction to the respiratory system. The where do I start studying thing, this is where you start studying. Make sure you understand those basics, and then you will be able to understand the bigger, more complex issues of the respiratory system later. All right, thank you for your time. The madness is over. See you in the next video. Humankind. Be both.